Have you ever noticed how some people simply cannot bear to be alone with themselves, even for a moment? They fill every silence with noise, every empty hour with distraction, every quiet space with the chatter of others. They move through life like moths drawn to flame, desperately seeking the light of external validation while running from the darkness within. Carl Jung, the pioneering Swiss psychiatrist who mapped the deepest territories of the human psyche, observed this phenomenon with profound insight. He understood that those who cannot be alone are not just avoiding solitude, they are fleeing from themselves. Jung once wrote that the meeting with oneself is, at first, the meeting with one's own shadow. This statement carries within it a revolutionary understanding of human nature that most of us have never truly grasped. Today, we're going to explore what Jung discovered about people who fear their own company and why this fear reveals something profound about the human condition. You'll discover the 5 psychological signs that reveal someone's terror of solitude, the hidden reasons why being alone feels like death to some people, and most importantly, the transformative truth that Jung uncovered about what happens when we finally learn to befriend our own presence. This isn't just about introversion versus extroversion. This goes much deeper, into the very core of who we are and who we're afraid to become. By the end of this journey, you'll understand why your relationship with solitude is actually your relationship with your soul, and why mastering the art of being alone might be the most important skill you'll ever develop. Let me paint you a picture that Jung himself might have recognized. Picture a woman who wakes up and immediately reaches for her phone, scrolling through social media before her feet even touch the floor. She turns on music while she showers, listens to podcasts during breakfast, and calls a friend on her way to work. Her days are packed with meetings, lunch dates, happy hours, and evening activities. When she finally gets home, the television goes on immediately, providing background noise while she orders dinner and video calls her sister. She falls asleep to Netflix, afraid of the silence that might come if she turned it off. This woman appears to have a rich social life, but Jung would have seen something else entirely. A person in desperate flight from her own consciousness. This represents the first sign Jung identified in people who cannot be alone, the compulsive need for external stimulation. But this isn't simply about being social or enjoying entertainment. This is about what Jung called participation mystique, the psychological state where a person loses their individual boundaries and becomes completely identified with external objects, people, or activities. They literally cannot exist without constant input from outside themselves because they have never learned to generate their own internal sense of being. Jung understood that this compulsion masks a deeper terror. When forced into silence, these individuals confront what he termed the void, not emptiness, but the presence of everything they have been avoiding about themselves. The uncomfortable thoughts, the unprocessed emotions, the parts of their personality they've rejected, the dreams they've abandoned, the authentic voice they've silenced. The external noise serves as a kind of psychic anesthesia, numbing them to the pain of their own unlived life. The psychological consequence of this pattern is profound. These individuals become what Jung called unconsciously possessed, controlled by forces they don't understand because they've never created the space to examine them. Their decisions, their relationships, their very sense of identity becomes dependent on external validation and stimulation. They lose touch with their own inner compass, their intuition, their capacity for genuine self-reflection. They become, in essence, strangers to themselves. The second sign Jung observed is even more subtle, but perhaps more revealing: the projection of inner emptiness onto others. Consider the person who becomes anxious or even angry when others choose solitude. They might say things like, "Why would you want to be alone? That's so depressing," or "You must be lonely," or "Come on, don't be antisocial." But Jung recognized that this isn't concern for others, it's projection of their own fears. Jung's concept of projection explains that we often see in others what we cannot bear to acknowledge in ourselves. When someone who fears solitude encounters another person who enjoys being alone, they're confronting their own disowned capacity for self-companionship. The person who chooses solitude becomes a mirror reflecting back their own abandonment of themselves, and this creates profound discomfort. These individuals often become what Jung might have called social vampires, not in a malicious sense, but in the way they unconsciously drain energy from others because they cannot generate their own internal sense of vitality. They need constant social interaction, not for the joy of connection, but for the psychological survival that comes from avoiding themselves. They become dependent on others to provide them with a sense of identity, purpose, and even reality. The deeper consequence here touches on what Jung called the individuation process, the lifelong journey towards psychological wholeness and authentic selfhood. Those who cannot be alone interrupt this natural process. They never develop what Jung termed the transcendent function, the capacity to bridge conscious and unconscious material, to integrate opposing aspects of the personality, to become truly individual rather than merely collective. They remain, in Jung's terms, unconscious of their own depths. This leads us to the third sign, which Jung considered particularly dangerous: the inability to access their own creative depths. Jung believed that creativity emerges from the relationship between consciousness and the unconscious, and this relationship can only be cultivated in solitude. He often spoke of how his most profound insights came during his periods of intense introspection, what he called his confrontation with the unconscious. Think of the person who claims they're not creative or not artistic, but who has never spent extended time alone with their thoughts, dreams, or imagination. They fill their lives with consuming rather than creating, watching rather than making, listening rather than expressing, following rather than leading. But Jung understood that this isn't a lack of creative capacity. It's a disconnection from the source of creativity itself. In Jung's understanding, the unconscious is not merely a repository of repressed material, it's also the wellspring of all creative potential. He called this the creative unconscious, and accessing it requires what he termed active imagination, a practice that can only be developed through sustained periods of solitude and introspection. When people avoid being alone, they cut themselves off from this creative source. They become, in essence, spiritually malnourished. The psychological consequence of this disconnection is a life of perpetual spiritual hunger. These individuals often report feeling empty, unfulfilled, or like something is missing, but they look for solutions in external achievements, relationships, or acquisitions. They don't realize that what they're seeking cannot be found outside themselves. It can only be cultivated through the courage to be alone with their own creative depths. Before we continue exploring these profound insights, I want to acknowledge something important. If you're finding value in this exploration of Jung's wisdom, if these ideas are resonating with something deep within you, consider supporting this journey by subscribing to the channel. But more than that, consider what Jung would have said about your willingness to sit with these challenging ideas. Your presence here, your attention to these concepts, is itself a form of solitude, a willingness to be alone with profound thoughts and uncomfortable truths. This is the beginning of what Jung called the work. The fourth sign Jung identified in people who fear solitude is perhaps the most psychologically complex. They experience what he called anima or animus possession in their relationships. This requires some explanation, as it touches the very heart of Jung's understanding of human psychology. Jung observed that every person carries within them both masculine and feminine psychological principles, regardless of their biological sex. The anima represents the feminine aspect in men, the source of emotionality, creativity, intuition, and relatedness. The animus represents the masculine aspect in women, the source of logos, reasoning, assertion, and discrimination. In psychologically healthy individuals, these contrasexual aspects are integrated and provide access to the full spectrum of human experience. However, when people cannot be alone, they often project these internal aspects onto external relationships, becoming what Jung called possessed by them. A man who cannot access his own anima, his capacity for emotional depth and intuitive wisdom, becomes desperately dependent on women to provide these qualities for him. He cannot be alone because being alone would confront him with his emotional poverty, his disconnection from his own feeling nature. Similarly, a woman who cannot access her own animus, her capacity for independent thought and decisive action, becomes possessed by the need for men to provide her with direction and authority. She cannot be alone because solitude would force her to confront her own lack of inner masculine strength, her inability to guide herself. This creates what Jung called unconscious relationships, partnerships based not on genuine love and recognition of the other as a separate individual, but on the desperate need to access through another what one cannot find within oneself. These relationships are characterized by codependency, projection, and emotional volatility because they're not really relationships between two whole people. They're attempts to complete oneself through another. The psychological consequence of this pattern is devastating. These individuals never develop what Jung called psychological bisexuality, the capacity to access both masculine and feminine principles within themselves. They remain psychologically one-sided, dependent on others for completion, and unable to experience the deep satisfaction that comes from inner wholeness. Their fear of solitude prevents them from discovering that they already contain everything they seek in others. The fifth and most profound sign Jung identified is what he called the flight from the self. In Jungian psychology, the self, with a capital S, represents the totality of the psyche, both conscious and unconscious elements integrated into a unified whole. It's the archetype of meaning, wholeness, and spiritual fulfillment. Jung distinguished between the ego, our conscious sense of identity, and the self, our deeper, more complete nature. People who cannot be alone are often fleeing from an unconscious encounter with their own self. This might seem paradoxical. Why would someone run from their own completeness? But Jung understood that meeting the self is both the most fulfilling and most terrifying experience possible for a human being. It requires confronting not just our shadow, the parts of ourselves we've rejected, but also our light, our unlived potential, our deepest purposes, our authentic nature. Consider the successful businessman who fills every moment with work, social obligations, and distractions, yet feels a gnawing sense that his life lacks meaning. Jung would say this person is running from an encounter with his self, which might be calling him toward a completely different way of being, perhaps as an artist, a teacher, or a healer. The businessman cannot be alone because solitude might allow this deeper calling to break through his carefully constructed identity. Or think of the woman who surrounds herself with social activity and caregiving for others, yet feels increasingly empty and resentful. Herself might be calling her toward greater independence, creative expression, or spiritual development. She cannot be alone because solitude might reveal how much of her life has been spent meeting others' expectations rather than her own authentic needs. Jung called this encounter with the self the most important task of life, but also acknowledged that it requires tremendous courage. It means potentially dismantling the persona, the mask we wear in the world, that has brought us social acceptance and external success. It means facing the gap between who we've been and who we're meant to become. It means accepting responsibility for our own psychological and spiritual development. The flight from the self creates what Jung termed the unlived life, an existence characterized by conformity, emotional numbness, and spiritual starvation. These individuals achieve external markers of success but feel internally impoverished. They may have relationships, careers, and social recognition, but lack the deep satisfaction that comes from living authentically. But here's where Jung's insight becomes even more profound. He understood that the very discomfort these individuals feel in solitude is actually the call of the self. The restlessness, the anxiety, the sense of emptiness they experience when alone. These are not pathological symptoms to be medicated or distracted away. They are the psyche's attempt to guide them toward greater wholeness. Jung often spoke of symptoms as the psyche's way of forcing us to pay attention to what we've been ignoring. The inability to be alone is not a character flaw or a social preference. It's a symptom of spiritual malnutrition. It's the psyche's way of saying, you've been running from yourself for too long. It's time to come home. This brings us to the most crucial revelation of Jung's understanding. The fear of solitude is ultimately the fear of transformation. Every moment of genuine solitude contains the potential for profound change. In the silence, without the constant input and validation from external sources, we're forced to encounter our own thoughts, feelings, dreams, and deeper callings. We might discover that the life we've been living is not aligned with our authentic nature. We might realize that we've been seeking in others what we can only find within ourselves. We might confront the parts of ourselves we've rejected, the dreams we've abandoned, the authentic voice we've silenced. Jung understood that this confrontation with ourselves is not just psychologically healing, it's spiritually essential. He wrote extensively about what he called the religious function of the psyche, the innate human need for meaning, wholeness, and connection to something greater than the ego. This spiritual dimension of human experience can only be accessed through periods of solitude and introspection. Those who cannot be alone are cut off from this spiritual dimension of their nature. They remain trapped in what Jung called the ego's narrow world, a reality limited to conscious thoughts, social roles, and external achievements. They never discover what he termed the God within, the transcendent aspect of their own nature that provides meaning, guidance, and profound satisfaction. But here's the most beautiful aspect of Jung's understanding. The very fact that someone experiences discomfort in solitude indicates that their psyche is still alive, still calling them toward greater wholeness. The anxiety, the restlessness, the desperate need for distraction, these are not signs of pathology, but of spiritual hunger. They're the soul's way of saying, there's more to you than you've allowed yourself to discover. Jung believed that learning to be alone is not about isolation or withdrawal from the world. Rather, it's about developing what he called the capacity for relationship with oneself. This inner relationship becomes the foundation for all authentic external relationships. When we can be present with ourselves, with our thoughts, feelings, dreams, and deeper callings, we develop what Jung termed psychological sovereignty. We become less dependent on others for our sense of identity and worth, and more able to offer genuine love rather than needy attachment. The transformation that occurs when someone learns to be alone is profound. They begin to access what Jung called the wisdom of the unconscious. Dreams become meaningful, intuition develops, creative insights emerge, the inner critic softens, replaced by what Jung termed the wise old man or wise old woman, archetypal figures representing inner guidance and wisdom. They also begin to experience what Jung called individuation, the process of becoming who they truly are rather than who others expect them to be. This doesn't mean becoming selfish or antisocial. Rather, it means becoming so grounded in their own authentic nature that their interactions with others become more genuine, more spontaneous, and more loving. Perhaps most importantly, they begin to experience what Jung called the transcendent function, the capacity to bridge opposites within themselves. They can be both strong and vulnerable, independent and connected, rational and intuitive, active and receptive. They become, in Jung's beautiful phrase, a whole human being. The journey from fearing solitude to embracing it is what Jung called the hero's journey of the psyche. It requires courage to face the unknown territories within ourselves. It requires patience to sit with uncomfortable emotions and thoughts without immediately seeking distraction. It requires faith that the discomfort we feel in solitude is not punishment, but invitation, the psyche's way of guiding us toward greater wholeness. Jung often spoke of how his own periods of intense solitude, particularly during what he called his confrontation with the unconscious, led to his most profound insights and contributed to his psychological theories that have helped millions of people. He understood that the capacity to be alone is not just a personal asset, it's a gift to the world, because people who have learned to be with themselves can offer authentic presence to others. So if you recognize yourself in any of these patterns, if you've been running from solitude, filling every moment with external stimulation, projecting your inner emptiness onto others, or fleeing from the call of your own deeper nature, know that this recognition itself is the beginning of transformation. Jung believed that consciousness is the first step toward healing. Start small. Begin with moments of silence. Turn off the phone, the music, the television. Sit with yourself for just a few minutes each day. Notice what arises. Don't judge the thoughts or feelings that emerge. Simply observe them with compassion. Remember that everything you encounter in solitude is part of your own psyche, calling for attention and integration. Jung once wrote, "The privilege of a lifetime is being who you are, but we can only discover who we truly are through the courage to be alone with ourselves." In that solitude, we might discover that we're not empty or boring or unlovable. We're vast, complex, creative beings, capable of depths we never imagined. The person you've been running from in your fear of solitude is actually the person you've been seeking all along. They're not separate from you. They are you, waiting patiently for your return home.